Everybody. So I'm Lynn Hayes, and I have been an astrologer for a long time. And I know there's some people here that I know, but how many people feel like they don't really know what astrology is? Everybody has a pretty good working knowledge. So that's good. Astrology is a very complex subject. There's a lot of different layers. And I want to talk about what's coming up for us this year. I was going to say next year, but we're here already. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about some basic concepts that we'll need to know in order to understand what's happening. So I've given you a little outline. I'll follow it maybe partly, but I did give you a chart on the handout that I gave you. And is there anybody in this room that hasn't seen a chart like that before? Okay. So I just wanted to give that out. Usually if I give a talk like this, a lot of people don't know anything about astrology. And a lot of people think astrology is the horoscopes. You know, oh yeah, I read my horoscope in the newspaper. And that really has very little to do with astrology. It's poetry, it's creativity, but it doesn't really have anything to do with your chart, because your chart is like the one that's on that paper. It's very complicated. You have the sun, which is your sun sign, so if you say, I'm a Virgo, then that's your sun sign. You also have a moon sign, a rising sign, Mars, Mercury, Venus. So the chart is pretty complicated, and we are complicated human beings. So the beauty of being an astrological consultant is that I get to help people to learn more about themselves by looking into the chart to see all of the different psychological pieces that we have. Some of them work together, some of them work against each other. So in going through that process, we can find more information about how we can live a more successful, integrated, effective life. So astrology, there are, especially now, because with the internet, it's so easy to be an astrologer. When I started, we had to calculate the charts, we had to use algorithms. It was very complicated. We had like a stack of books we had to use. But now it's so easy because you can go online. You can go to astro.com and have any chart just calculated for you for free. So if you have a relationship and you want to see what the chart is, you can just pull it up at no charge. Which is wonderful, because I've always felt that astrology is something really that should be taught in schools. It would be wonderful if parents could see, this is why your child is this way, right? Or a child could say, it's okay that you can't decide what you want to do. You have Mars in Gemini. You may not decide till you're 50. And then people wouldn't, you know, it just gives us permission to be who we are. So, but there's a lot of different types of astrology and a lot of different schools, and nowadays there's kind of a resurgence of traditional astrology, which is much more fate-based. And so for those people, there is a time when something is going to happen. And so they will tell you, I want to be careful here because I don't want to criticize this particular school, but still show the downfall of it. I believe, and what I've seen and experienced, that our life is not set in stone. So the astrological cycles, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because we're talking about the astrological cycles of this year. So what's going to happen? Can we make a prediction of what specifically is going to happen? And the fact is we really can't. And even people who have tools and techniques to predict the future are very often wrong. So I don't attempt to predict the future. I just attempt to give you a weather report and maybe talk about some things that are likely to happen. There are definitely times in our life, oops, in our personal life, and also sort of on a global scale where certain planets are operating and where we're more likely to have certain experiences. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And I apologize if there's any astrology experts in the audience, but I want to sort of lay some groundwork before we really talk about it so that it really makes sense. I'm sort of sneaking in a little workshop here on astrology. So one thing people always want to know is, what about the 13th sign? There's a sign called, there's a constellation called Ophiuchus. Well, what about that? And why is it just 30-degree sections? The constellations aren't that size. So the zodiac is actually, the constellations mark the path of the sun around the earth. So just like that chart that you see in front of you, when you were if that was your chart, when you were born, you would be in the center of that chart. And some planets, the planets that are in the top half, would be up above the sky, in the visible sky, and the symbols that are in the bottom half would be in the invisible sky. So it's a symbolic system, and nobody can really explain why it works, but it just does. So I want to just talk about some of these concepts and symbols so that when I talk about what's coming this year and for the next few years, it'll make a little more sense. And my friend Karen here knows nothing about astrology, so she's going to tell me afterwards how I did. So hopefully this will all make sense. So we have a lot of planets now, and a lot of new planets are being discovered. And that's another question people often have. What about all these, there's trans-Neptunians, and there's the Kuiper Belt, and there's asteroids, and, we use basically 4 asteroids, but what about the other 100,000 asteroids? So there's so many bodies, and different astrologers will work with different elements. But basically, most astrologers, and me in particular, I use the solar system planets, and I use a few asteroids and another character called the Black Moon Lilith. That's a fascinating little piece of information. We might get to that, we might not. But so the planets that we can see in the sky, which are the sun and moon, which are actually luminaries, but we sort of lump them in and call them planets. The visible planets, which are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, those planets all represent an aspect of our personality. And they're pretty fast moving, except for Jupiter and Saturn, but the others are pretty fast moving. So when we talk about the astrology of 2019, we're not really going to talk about them because their influence only lasts for a few days. I will talk about Mercury retrograde, though, because that tends to go on for a few weeks, as some of you may know. Then we have outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Those 3 are transformational forces, and they are the slower moving planets, so their effects tend to be stronger and they last longer. And I'll be talking about those cycles because those are the bigger, long-lasting cycles that create the most change. And then sort of in and among those cycles, then we have the smaller cycles. So these planetary cycles operate on a few different levels. They operate on the macrocosmic level, the global level. So as an example, in 2008, Pluto, well, let me just ask you a quick question. How many people were here about 3 years ago when I spoke? Just a couple, okay. So you might remember I talked about the square of Uranus and Pluto, and some of the other astrologers who have spoken probably have spoken about that. But in 2008, Pluto which is a very little planet, and they were trying to demote it, which we all laughed about, because Pluto, as astrologically, is the most powerful planet that we have. When there's a Pluto cycle, it tends to last for 2 to 3, sometimes 4 or 5 years. Lasts for a long time. There's generally a lot of upheaval. And so on the macrocosmic level, that we all live in this world where we're all affected, any country, no matter where you live, we're affected especially by these outer planet transits. So in 2008, Pluto moved from Sagittarius, which is very optimistic and expansive and hopeful and has a lot of enthusiasm, into Capricorn, which is very practical and a little more rigid and more of a contracting principle. And you might remember in 2008, we had a major financial crisis, which you could just see as an astrologer, you could see it happening, because Sagittarius, under that influence, there was, people were buying houses that they couldn't afford, and they were borrowing money based on faith, which is another Sagittarius principle. So that all happened in 2008, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But that's an example of a macrocosmic cycle. So no matter who you are, maybe you individually weren't affected by that because maybe that planet wasn't hitting a point in your own personal chart at that time, and there might be another time when Pluto hits a sensitive point in your chart and you have an intense experience. Sometimes when you hear stories like, my mother died, and then my brother died, and my cat died, and then I lost my job, that not all Pluto experiences are like that, but when something like that happens, Pluto's probably involved somewhere on the microcosmic level. So I wanted to talk about that. Also, planets are happier in some signs than in others. And one thing that's happening this year is that 3 planets are in their own sign. So where they're happy, where they operate freely, where they don't have to create a lot of drama to make a point. So I'll talk more about that. We have Saturn in Capricorn. We have Mars in Aries, just went into Aries a couple of days ago. And then we have Jupiter in Sagittarius. So, okay, so I also wanted to just touch on eclipses. And if you line up 100 astrologers and ask them a question, they'll have 100 different answers, and then they'll fight about it. So eclipses is one of these topics. How important are eclipses? And it's hard for the consumer to really know, because just like any other writers on the web, we are trying to get eyeballs. And the more dramatic you can make your information, the more eyeballs you get. So you'll read a lot about eclipses and what's going to happen. And personally, I'm a bit of a skeptic. Not that not that eclipses aren't important, but they are certainly not anything to be fearful of. I do a lot of business. I get a lot of business from people who are having an eclipse hitting a planet and they think they might die. And I have to explain to them that they probably won't. So it's not really anything to be afraid of. But eclipses definitely open up a portal of energy. And some of their effect has to do, on us personally, has to do with how our own chart is affected. But I am going to talk about the eclipses. But just know that every year there's 4 to 6 eclipses, so they're not that rare. They're really nothing to be afraid of. I do want to talk a little bit about my book and the vision crafting process. I was going to wait, but I'm afraid I'll forget. So one of the things in my years that I've been doing this, when I started out, it was so exciting to be able to see people's personalities in their chart and be able to explain to them why they are the way they are. But then, where do you go from there? Like, okay, this is why you have a hard time, but how do you fix that? How can you integrate that? How can you work with that? So that's when so in the early 90s, I got very involved with the Tony Robbins movement and the personal development. And I worked with a lot of those different modalities, and I started doing some workshops. And I called it vision crafting because it involves creating a vision for a life that you want to live. And what I had found was through all my goal setting and my setting intentions, I had manifested everything that was on my list. But I was overwhelmed, I was working too hard. It wasn't exactly quite right. So I kept tweaking, and I kept sort of coming up with something that would work better for me. And a lot of the reason why I was having some of these difficulties was because of some of the issues that I was working with. So I had to kind of dig into that. So I started doing these workshops to kind of help people go through that process, and I called it vision crafting. And then I did this book, which is up front, and it is available on my website or on Amazon. But it's a self-guided workbook. So it has questions, it has a background about the science behind intention and manifestation. It's not like The Secret, and I really don't like the word affirmations because we've done them so many times. And if they're just words that you hear from somebody, like every day I'm getting wealthier or something like that, it's not really working with your own issues. So if you have a problem with money, why is that? What are you afraid of? Why do you feel that there is scarcity? And how can you work with that through language to repattern the belief systems is really what this is about. So take a look. You can just, on Amazon, just put in the search bar, vision crafting. But that is, I think, a really useful tool that we have in the astrological language, that we are able to see these patterns in the chart, and so we can then learn to integrate them. Okay, so I'm not supposed to ask for questions until a little bit later, but if you have some questions, please hold them, okay? So I want to look back a little bit. I talked about Pluto moving from Sagittarius into Capricorn. Pluto is kind of a generational planet. So those of us who were born between 1939 and 1956 or so, there's a little bleed through on both sides. We all have Pluto in Leo. And Leo is the sign of creative self-expression. And all of us that are around that age have made a real art form out of expressing ourselves and being, fabulous individuals. And we're learning how to age creatively and all of these things, which didn't really happen before. So every Pluto generation has a different flavor. We talk about the millennials, that's the Pluto and Scorpio generation. Then we have the Pluto and Sagittarius generation that's all about Instagram. Sagittarius is about the media. So they're obsessed. Pluto can show obsession and sort of this need to reinvent yourself in some way. So that generation is reinventing themselves through the media. And so in 2008, Pluto moved into Capricorn, and Pluto will be there until 2023. So it spends quite a bit of time. That's 15 years. It spends anywhere between 12 and 20 years in a sign. So those are the biggest cycles. Those are the sort of overarching cycles that create the astrological weather. So what we also had in 2010 was Uranus, which is the planet of radical change and rebellion and breaking out of routines in the status quo. Uranus moved into Aries. It had been in Pisces for the last 7 years or so. So when it moved into Aries in 2010, there was this huge rebellious wave, the Arab Spring. That was the, what was the, oh gosh, I'm blanking out. The people that were setting up tent cities in, what was that? Occupy, right. Occupy Wall Street, right? It started and then it was Occupy everything. That was in 2010 when all this was happening. So there was this surge. So Aries is the sign of the warrior. It's the sign of the individual. So when Uranus moved into Aries also, because Aries does have a lot to do with war and the warrior, and then Uranus is the individual, then you have this sort of big surge. I mean, certainly we had had terrorism before, but after that, the battles were really between more individuals. It was more individual rebellion and less like China versus North Korea, big countries with warfare. So between 2010, is that right? Between 2010 when Uranus moved into Aries and 2017 or so, Uranus and Pluto were in a 90-degree angle in the sky. We call that a square. It's like this, right? So it's like a square. It's a challenging aspect where those two planets create a lot of change. When you have the planet of destruction and regeneration, which is Pluto, in a challenging aspect to the planet of rebellion and radical upheaval, you can imagine that there's a lot that goes on. And those two planets, the last time they came together in a challenging way like that, in a conjunction, was in the 60s between 1962 and 1968. And that's when that was the 60s, when everything just sort of changed. So this cycle of Uranus and Pluto, it tends to come about every 40 years or so. And, depending on where we are in the world, the effect is different. Some of it has to do with the signs as well. In the 60s, Uranus and Pluto aligned in Virgo, which is the sign of convention, details, perfectionism, but also it's a very conservative sign. And here comes Uranus and Pluto kind of blowing all that up. So Uranus last year moved into Taurus. Uranus and Taurus, well, let me back up a little bit. So Capricorn is an earth sign. So you all, I'm sure, are familiar with the 4 elements. We have fire, air, earth, and water. And fire is the element, astrologically and energetically, fire is the element that gives us motivation and energy, and it tends to be somewhat aggressive. So with Uranus in Aries, there was a lot more aggression and a kind of a release of that energy. The earth signs, Capricorn, Taurus, and Virgo, are grounded, they're more practical, but they also literally have to do with the earth. So when Pluto moved into Capricorn, Capricorn also has to do with the structures that we create in the world, in our life. And when Pluto moved into Capricorn, we started to have a lot of infrastructure problems all over the world. We're probably going to see that continue. A lot of our infrastructure is old, it's not really being repaired. And with Pluto in Capricorn, there is kind of a disintegration of those structures, or a tendency. There's also a consolidation of power with Pluto in Capricorn, and we've definitely been seeing that. And I'm not going to get too political. I was asked not to, and I wouldn't anyway. But I think that is certainly clear, and that's a hallmark of the Capricorn sign, which is more concerned about mastery of the material world. So when Pluto is in Capricorn, there's a consolidation of power. But there also is a tendency towards earth changes, towards earthquakes, just sort of a shifting. There was just as the earth is moving, some of the underground faults and things are moving with it. So there's a lot of shifting with that, and with Uranus moving into Taurus, which it did this last year. Taurus is the sign that more than any represents the earth. Taurus has to do with experiences of pleasure, physical touch, has to do with delicious food and gardening. In the tarot, I always think of the Empress card as representing Taurus, because there's a little bunny and there's sunflowers, and it's really integrating with the earth. So with Uranus, the planet of radical change, revolution, blowing things up, in Taurus, there is likely to be more of these earth changes that people have talked about for a long time. There's also, because Taurus also has to do with financial security and stability, and we started to see, with Uranus in Aries, we saw the rise of the gig economy, which is people working on their own. That's very Aries and Uranus, very independent, autonomous. And with Uranus in Taurus, we started to see a real rise of the cryptocurrencies. Uranus rules technology, and Taurus does have a lot to do with the economic system, the money system specifically. Not economics so much, but the actual money. So with Uranus and Taurus, we are likely to see a big shakeup of the economic systems all over the country. We'll probably see, this cycle goes all the way from 2018 to 2026. So it's a 7-8 year cycle. So we're likely to see a challenge to the federal bank here in the United States. I'm going to talk in the second part more about the chart of the United States and what that means for us. But because this is a global cycle in the macrocosmic level, we're probably going to see a real shift in terms of financial systems. There's also, because Taurus does have to do with gardening and agriculture and anything having to do with the earth, we could find some famines, food deprivation, and droughts. Uranus is a very dry influence, so any sign that it goes through, there tends to be kind of a drying up. Neptune, which we're going to talk about, is the opposite. Neptune's very wet. So Neptune is in its own sign of Pisces right now, and we're getting a lot of water, you might have noticed. So Saturn is in Capricorn. Saturn went into Capricorn in December of 2017. So it's been in Capricorn for about a year. Capricorn is Saturn's own sign. Saturn is happy in Capricorn. I said earlier, you might remember, some planets are happier. Planets are happier in some signs than others. Saturn is very happy in Capricorn, but it really demands realism. Saturn is the planet that instills doubt in us. It's the part of ourselves that says, I'm not really good enough, I can't really do that. I want to be successful, but I'm not sure I can. I need more school, I need more credibility. That's Saturn's job, is to encourage us to work harder. Saturn's like a mentor. So if you have a mentor, you want the mentor to say, this is good and this is not good. This is what you really need to work on. But a lot of us, when we're told by Saturn, in a Saturn transit, in a personal Saturn cycle, oh, I just can't do it, it's so hard. And Saturn does sometimes bring tests and challenges when we're having a personal Saturn cycle. So by that I mean when Saturn in the sky hits a system in your chart that's sensitive to some point. So feel free to ask me questions about that during the break. But generally for everybody right now, Saturn is in Capricorn. So there's a real turn away from the sort of blind optimism. That's Jupiter. Jupiter is just optimistic and has a lot of faith. Have we got any Sagittarians here? Okay, so you're the glass half full, everything's wonderful. And do we have any Capricorns? Yeah, so are you kind of the opposite? Oh, okay, see? Jupiter on the rising. So Jupiter is part of her persona. Jupiter, happy, optimistic. She's a secret Capricorn. So this is the beauty of astrology, and that's how the complexity works. And that's actually what we have going on right now, because Jupiter is in its own sign of Sagittarius. And Jupiter loves to be in Sagittarius because Jupiter can act unfettered without any other influence. So we have we've seen this I don't know if any of you follow the stock market, but over the last couple of weeks, it went up 600 points, it went down 1,000 points, it went up 1,000 points. So it's been, we're seeing, first there's all this depression. Not that Capricorns are depressed, I don't mean to say that, but they do tend to be very practical. They're not that particular Capricorn archetype, and you have to kind of be careful because sun sign, like this lady is a perfect example. Just because somebody's sun sign is in a sign, they might have a lot of other influences that are completely different. Sagittarius rising gives her a completely different bent. Well, it's not that it overcomes the Capricorn, it's just the two of them are working together or against each other, as the case may be. And that's what we're seeing now. We have Jupiter in Sagittarius. Yeah, the markets, there's buying opportunities. Just go and buy more stocks. And then Capricorn, the sort of doubting realism comes in and says, no, there's going to be a crash. So that's what we have going on. And that's going to continue. That's one of the themes for the year, frankly, until December. We have this force of expansion and optimism fighting against the force of contraction. Saturn is going to be getting pretty close to Pluto in March. So between March and I think July, I have this written down in my notes, Saturn and Pluto are going to be pretty close in Capricorn. They're not going to converge completely until January, but especially in April, May, June, they're going to be close enough that I believe that we're going to see it. And so Saturn and Pluto together, Saturn used to be the planet of death before we had Pluto. So Saturn can be kind of a ruthless taskmaster, and especially if things get too inflated, which is what we saw when Pluto moved into Capricorn. So Pluto was in Sagittarius, which kind of fueled this desire to keep building bigger and bigger houses, have more and more money. That was during the time when I was, well, I guess I was a little before, but Pluto moved into Sagittarius in 1995, and the whole personal, the thing that started with Tony Robbins in the early 90s became a real art form, and there was, be more successful and have more money and have more, stuff, and then you started to get hoarding and, people buying storage units because they had too much stuff, which is very Pluto and Sagittarius. It's when the abundance becomes so much that it becomes a dysfunction. Then following that, because each sign reacts to the one behind it, which you'll see if you think about all the different signs. So Capricorn reacts to Sagittarius. Sagittarius is expansive, optimistic. And then Capricorn is like, no, you have to be realistic. This is based on nothing. This is based on... I'm looking at these two ladies, they're sisters. I'm wondering what's going on there. So anyway, so Pluto, if there hadn't been too much inflation of the optimistic lack of realism, or as Alan Greenspan called it, irrational exuberance. Do any of you remember that? That's very Pluto and Sagittarius. So if people had kind of been reasonable, they had bought houses that they could afford, they didn't, go out and mortgage their child's future for their third home, then Pluto and Capricorn would not have crashed the system. It's not that the planets create problems, they just sort of, this is my theory anyway, they're working to find balance. I believe that the universe is always striving for balance. And so when things are out of balance and then you have a Saturn transit or a Saturn cycle or something with Pluto, there's going to be some reorganization. And so with Saturn and Pluto converging here in starting in the spring and summer of 2019, but coming together completely in January, I think we're going to have a real downturn. So they've been talking about it for a long time. People have been saying, oh, the markets are overinflated. When are they going to fall? That is my theory. That's not a prediction, but it's a theory that that's something that could happen. When Saturn and Pluto converge in Capricorn, there's a stripping down of the fluff and just, getting down to really the essentials, what's really working. We're probably going to see more of a consolidation of power. We've already been seeing that with Saturn and Capricorn. There have been, like in China, there's been a few countries where they've taken permanent power. So I think we'll probably see more of that. Then the other big planet, and that's, I think, going to take me right to the, I didn't quite make it. Here's the magic wand. Oh, I have 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. I'll just get to the end of this, and then we'll take a break. The other one I wanted to talk about was Neptune. So the big transformational planets are Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Uranus inspires us to break free of routines and of rules and regulations and to find a new way of living. Pluto, we've already talked about, Pluto sort of destroys anything that's really not working. So, as an example of Pluto, there was just the hurricane, was it Michael, that came through Florida and decimated Mexico Beach. But there was one house that was standing, and it was, I think, built of concrete. Anyway, it was built to withstand the hurricane. So people that are like, oh, I don't believe a hurricane's going to come. I'm just going to put up this whatever kind of a house that's not meant to withstand hurricanes. Those houses were gone, but this really solid house stayed. And that, I feel, is really symbolic of the Pluto archetype. So then we have Neptune. Neptune is the planet that inspires us to transcend the material world and have a direct experience of the divine. So it's the planet of spirituality. It's the planet not of religion, which is more Jupiter, which is more meaning, what gives my life meaning? That is more Jupiter. But Neptune is about, we just sat for a minute and we had a wonderful experience of being within ourselves, of feeling connected, of feeling, the divine in the room. And that's a Neptune experience. Neptune also has to do with creativity, because when we are writers or artists, painters or inventors, as I just discovered, we are actually channeling this divine energy through us. You know, artists and painters, they're just, the beauty is just coming through them. And so Neptune has a lot to do with creativity and imagination as well. So Neptune is in its own sign of Pisces, where it's very happy, and it went into Pisces in 2011. So there is a very strong energy right now of people that are working together to try to change the energy of the planet. And some of this is consciously, and some of it I think is maybe less consciously. But if you look at the proliferation of yoga studios and meditation groups and sound healing, and all of these are very Neptune and Pisces types of things. And that's something that I think could really be a great boon. That's the positive side of Neptune and of Pisces. The negative side is that with all of this magic, there is a potential for delusion and for illusion and confusion. All of these three, have presence when we lose our discrimination. So we've also seen a lot of flooding since Neptune went into Pisces in 2011. But there has been this sort of spiritual infusion, which I haven't seen since the early 90s. I don't know how many of you were on this path then, but there was another big infusion of spirituality when Uranus and Neptune converged. That was between 91 and 94. So there's quite a bit of that right now. And I think there's also with Neptune a big heart opening. So there's an abundance of compassion that I don't think have seen. So even though we have all of these other influences, there is this wave of compassion and understanding that is also present. So on that hopeful note, I think we'll take a break. So welcome back. Some of you are still here. I'm glad to see that. Nobody's run. So a lot of people asked me, what about the money? So we'll talk about that. One thing that I just want to mention too is that everybody doesn't experience things the same way, and a lot of that depends on what's going on in your own chart, and if and that is something that it's hard to really be your own astrologer, even though there's a lot of resources. So it's always a good idea, I think, to have a checkup with an astrologer every year, every few years, to kind of see what kind of cycles are coming up for you personally. These cycles that we're talking about are the big overarching cycles that probably everybody is going to have, somewhat of an experience about. I think I put this last on the outline, but I think it's probably good to just mention. So as far as, I want to talk about what's going on with the U.S. chart, because there's some financial stuff there, and then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what to do with the money. It's tricky. I'm not a financial expert, although I think about money a lot. I have Jupiter in Taurus, so I really love to be secure, but it's kind of hard to have specific advice, but I'll give you sort of some general thoughts on that. So for this half, it was nice how it kind of got divided. Now we're going to talk about the actual events that are happening this year. So I do this with my client consults too. I like to start with the big cycles. Here are the big things that are going on. Here are the sort of mid-size, and then we drill down into the details. So that's what we'll do tonight. So one of the cycles that we have going on is Saturn in a sextile, which is a harmonious aspect to Neptune. And that's going to go, there's 3 different points of that cycle. So this may be more information than you're looking for, but a lot of these planetary cycles have more than one alignment. So you have Saturn and Neptune in the sky, and then they meet in this angle. And then they keep moving, and then sometimes they retrograde, right? You've heard of Mercury retrograde. So they're not really moving backwards, but we look at the planets from Earth. So they seem like they're moving backwards. So it seems like it's hitting a second time. And then the planet turns direct again and hits a third time. Sometimes with Uranus and Pluto, that alignment happened 7 times. That was a huge, big cycle with a lot of change. These 2 that I'm going to talk about are not that intense. They're not going to last that long. So Saturn sextile Neptune, that's a really nice alignment that we have starting in January. And there's 3 different hits, and towards the end I'm going to sort of go month by month and just talk about some of the general energies. But Saturn is the focus and the discipline, the hard work, achievement, the material world. And Neptune is the spirituality, the imagination, and the creativity. So when those 2 are working together in a harmonious way, that is wonderful for combining imagination and creativity with the hard work and focus of Saturn. And also to harness Neptune's compassion to practical applications. One thing about Neptunian compassion is it can be one of the negative, my words are leaving me. One of the negative pieces of Neptune or Pisces is the tendency to sort of lose the self. That's part of the kind of magical, wonderful, mystical experience is you lose yourself in something marvelous. But if you lose your sense of self, then it's a little less marvelous. So with Neptune in a harmonious aspect with Saturn, we get more of that practical, grounded influence. So this is a really good time for really everybody, and I'll give you the dates where this aspect is going to be the strongest. But it's really good for creative people because it gives creative people sort of a solid, grounded outlet. And it's also really good for creative and spiritual people. But it's also really good for business people, for practical people, for bean counter type people, because there's this infusion of creativity that comes along with it. So sort of in tandem with that, we have a challenging aspect from Jupiter to Neptune. So Jupiter and Neptune, I think of those 2 as the Santa Claus planetary combination, because Jupiter is so abundant and positive and optimistic, and Neptune is imaginative and creative and opens up the doorways of higher consciousness. I can use that language here, which is nice. But because it's a challenging aspect between them, we sometimes get the more difficult expression, which is more of the sort of over-optimism and self-deception and, oh, this is so wonderful, I'm not really going to look at the details, it just feels great, I'm going to do it. So with those 2 things are kind of happening at the same time in January. So I'm going to err on the side of positivity and say that really, in January, if there's anything that you are thinking about or anything that you have an idea that you want to make happen, it's a good time for that. Doors are definitely open. Even the challenging aspects of Jupiter are pretty kind, they're pretty mild. So there's a lot of this open heart, spiritual connection with the divine. It's a wonderful time to meditate, to do more yoga, sound healing, all of these things that bring us into an experience where we're really connected to a divine influence. So we talked a little bit about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which, Saturn being the tester and then Pluto being the destroyer, those two kind of being tough. So this is not the first Saturn-Pluto conjunction. They are not that uncommon, and I don't have the dates or the number of years right now. But the last one in Capricorn was in 1518. So, that cycle is a pretty big one. I think we will see an intensification of this trend towards oligarchy. One thing that worries me a little bit about all of this Neptune influence, Jupiter, Neptune, is that we do, especially in this country, have a tendency towards kind of blindly following certain paths, certain political viewpoints, without really using discrimination. Saturn really wants discrimination, and Capricorn, Saturn in Capricorn has a really strong push for that. And so where there's not discrimination, you can get, this is the kind of influence that creates the kind of cults. I don't want this to scare anybody, but this is the kind of influence that's associated with the sorts of cults that had these mass suicides and the sort of mass hysteria. So I think we can be really grateful that we have the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the midst of all this, because it will, at the least, ground the energy and bring it back. So for some people, that's going to be uncomfortable. With the stock market, when the stock market gets too inflated and it's not really based on anything except, oh, that stock is going up, I'll buy some, and then it'll go up more. That's not you're not really buying anything, you're just buying this idea that it's going to go up. It's like a pyramid scheme. So that kind of thing is always bound to come back to earth. It's a correction. And even though I know that, I still look at my investments go down and I think, oh, I've lost money. When really, it's all just numbers and air. So anyway, the Saturn-Pluto is going to definitely give a grounding force. It's going to pull everything back. So anywhere that there's been some illusion and delusion, I think we'll see it in the political realm, where people may have kind of an idealized view of some things that are happening. I think we'll see a reality check and an awakening. Those awakenings are not always comfortable, but they're really important. I want to make sure I don't miss anything here. So we also, I did not write these dates down, but, in 2020, this is just sort of a look ahead, speaking about Jupiter, Jupiter and Saturn are going to align in Aquarius in 2020. So we have this very strong Capricornian influence this year, Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn sneaking ahead. At the end of the year, we have what we call a stellium with 5 planets all in Capricorn. So it's a very Capricornian year. Next year, we start to slide into Aquarius. And, the idea about when the age of Aquarius starts is a matter of much debate. If you do any Googling, there's a lot of different information out there. But I think there's a lot of evidence right now that we are moving into the age of Aquarius. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining what that is astrologically. It's an astronomical thing that has to do with the precession of the equinoxes, but it's a 2150-year cycle. So we're in the age of Pisces now, and we have been since somewhere between 500 BC and 1 or 200 AD. It's very confusing about when that happens. But we're definitely seeing some evidence of that, the influence of computers. Aquarius really has very little to do with what they talked about in the Hair musical, with love, peace, and understanding. It's not really Aquarius, but there is a lot of technology. There's a lot of, Aquarius is kind of dry and can be judgmental. So I have this theory that when the machines take over, when Pluto goes into Aquarius, that they'll take one look at us and say, these people need to go. They're really not doing a very good job. We can do it much better, because Aquarius is very rational. It's the scientist. So that's going to be a while, so don't freak out.
What year?
Huh? What year? I think it's 2027, actually.
Oh my. That's not that long from now.
I think I have that in my notes somewhere here. Yeah. Well, the other thing is there's this 800-year cycle that they call the Great Chronocrater, which you don't have to remember, but it's the cycles of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. And it's an interesting way to time history. But there's a new cycle in air that starts in 2020. So we have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. We're going to have Pluto moving into Aquarius. Uranus is going to move, was already in Aquarius. But anyway, so we're really moving into this Aquarian influence, which is going to be, there is much more of a sense of social justice with Aquarius, of equality. It's not really like Capricorn, which is kind of every man for himself. Capricorn is about achievement and success, and a lot of other things too. I'm really simplifying this so it's not too confusing. But the Aquarius influence, I think, is definitely going to lift some of this darkness that we've been seeing. So that brings me to the details for 2019. So just sort of generally, this is very general, and I do want to give you a quick plug for my blog. I have a couple of different writing things that I do. One is a blog. My website is called astrodynamics.net, and I have my cards up front. And I started calling my practice astrodynamics because of this wanting to help, not just tell people about their chart, but help to create some healing and some integration. So it's a more dynamic experience and just a sort of a more passive kind of a reading. So on my website there is a blog, and I like to write about how current events and different people, how they're influenced by astrology. When somebody does something crazy, I always want to know what's going on in their chart. Why are they doing this? And just also I like to tie it in with current events, and it's interesting to see, Mars went into Aries and then this happened. Then I also write a monthly report on where the planets are and sort of like what we're talking about now, what the energies are for that month, and it's written in pretty plain English, so it's easy to understand. So if you want to sign up for the monthly report, there's a sign-up sheet that's up there too, and then you can just follow my blog. You can subscribe to that, and then you'll be up on all the latest astrological info. So in January, so this is just sort of going through the year, just roughly what the energies are. In January, I talked about this a little bit. We have the square of Jupiter to Neptune, the sort of Santa Claus, maybe a little bit of illusion or delusion, but a big spiritual opening, coinciding with the harmonious sextile between Saturn and Neptune. So a lot of Neptune in January, which is very good for creativity as well as spirituality. And just anything having to do with the heart. Under the influence of Neptune, the heart opens up, there's tremendous compassion, and a lot of divine love. We also have 2 eclipses. And I thought I had the dates for those, but I don't seem to have those. But anyway, so there's 2 eclipses. There's already a lot of news. Oh, it's a blood wolf moon. It's going to change your whole life. So I would not take all of that too seriously. But if an eclipse has a degree that's at the same degree as one of your planets, especially the sun, the moon, or the ascendant, then it could affect you. There could be a significant effect of some kind. Sometimes that's just an awakening. Sometimes there's an opening of some energy, maybe, that had been kind of locked up. So I do feel that eclipses are good times, even if you don't know if you're affected personally or not. It's a good time to kind of sit and pay attention, look at your intentions, see how you feel about your life, what needs to be changed, because there are portals of energy that open, usually for about 3 days before and about 3 days after. There is a lot of evidence that eclipses are also tied to geoactive events, geocosmic, geological, weather events, those sorts of things. You know, you can have floods and earthquakes, but not necessarily, affecting you personally. But there is an intensification for those eclipses. In February, there's really no major alignments. So there's minor alignments with Venus and Mars, and there might be a couple of days here and there, but there's not really anything major in February. Then in March, Mercury turns retrograde. So Mercury, and I'm going to talk fast because I think I only have a few minutes. Mercury turns retrograde or goes retrograde for 3 weeks, 4 times a year. If you don't know about Mercury retrograde, it's a time when Mercury appears to be moving backwards from our perspective, and there's a shadow period of about a week on either side when the movement of Mercury slows down, and we start to have potentially some difficulty with communication. Sometimes these things are very difficult and sometimes they're not. Knowing about Mercury retrograde, I think, really helps things. So if you order something and it doesn't come and FedEx keeps telling you that it's been delivered and you have to call them, which I've had to do today, oh, well, I shouldn't have ordered that when Mercury was retrograde. So it just makes everything make sense, which is something I really appreciate about astrology. So we also, in March, we have Saturn and Pluto getting closer. They're within 5 degrees then. So there may be, if you have planets, I believe that's going to be like 19 and 22 degrees Capricorn. So if you have planets in that range, in Capricorn, Cancer, Libra, or Aries, the 4 cardinal signs. Hello? Oh, there, thank you. You might feel that that's going to be a personal cycle for you. So you may start feeling some blocks, some intensity, possibly some challenges in your life, depending on what else is going on. One thing that people, when they do their own astrology, they're only looking at one thing and they're not able to see the whole picture. So just kind of be aware of that and don't scare yourself. In April, we have Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn all turn retrograde. So the outer planets are so Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are retrograde for half the year. So it's not necessarily a big deal. But when we have planets that change direction, we often have a shift of some kind. And that's 3 planets all turning retrograde. So we are likely to kind of feel like we're being held back. Retrograde cycles, I feel, are really important. You know, we want to go, go, go and make things happen and get things done. But retrograde cycles, just like Mercury retrograde, is really good for planning. For anything that starts with an RE, you might have heard this, for reevaluating, revising, rereading, renovating. It's a good time to sit back and sort of look at things and just reevaluate where you are. Then the planets turn direct and there's more motion going forward. So don't be surprised in April when there's this sort of retrograde force, if you start to feel like things aren't really happening at the speed that you want them to. Well, that's when they turn retrograde. So they will all be retrograde until Jupiter will turn direct in August. So between April and August, 3 planets will be retrograde. 3 planets retrograde. Oh,
hey,
5
Lynn.
minutes. Yeah.
Hey. I was just going to let you know that we started a little bit late, so we'll give you, 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes, and then maybe 5 minutes of Q&A.
Okay. All right. I'm going to talk fast so we have more time for questions. I keep thinking this is the microphone, but it's not. So, 3 planets retrograde is really the normal number. There's been some studies about that, and more people have 3 planets retrograde than any other number. So it's not like this is a huge number, but because they all turn retrograde at the same time, there's an energetic shift. And that can sometimes, when we're talking about the financial markets, when there's a big retrograde shift, sometimes there's a shift in the markets. So if the markets are kind of down and dour, the markets could get this infusion, but I think it's more likely to go the other way. In May, again, there's no major alignments, but Saturn and Pluto are moving closer together. In May, they're 3 degrees apart. That's as close as they're going to get. So in June, we have the sort of the peak of that Saturn-Pluto dance, that they're close, but they're not quite aligned yet. We also have the Neptune, the Jupiter-Neptune and the Saturn-Neptune I talked about earlier. So that's good, but I feel like that's going to be a very juicy month. That just feels good to me. I don't know why. I sort of feel, we'll see if this turns out to be true. I sort of feel like April through June is the contraction, and then here we have June with the Jupiter-Neptune, and it gets a little more juicy, a little more optimism, a little more sense of possibilities comes in. Then in July, we have Mercury retrograde between July 7th and the 18th. And again, about a week on either side, 5 to 7 days. We have a couple of eclipses that month, and we have Saturn beginning to move away from Pluto. So nothing really major except a couple of eclipses. None of these eclipses, I looked at all of them, none of them have really huge, tight, challenging alignments where the energy can be a lot more potent. Then in August, we have 3 planets in Virgo. So we're starting to move into the Virgo season. And also the new moon is in Virgo, so that's 3 planets plus the moon. And then Jupiter turns direct. So that's again, so when Jupiter turns direct towards the end of the month, I don't have the date, but you can keep up with my blog, you'll know all this stuff. That will probably be another shift of some kind. Then in September, we have the final Jupiter square Neptune, and then Saturn. So Saturn has been retrograde, then it turns direct, we call it, and starts to move closer to Pluto again, because that's September, and by January, the two will be in they'll be hugging, actually. They will be united. So September is, I think starts to get a little bit more contracted. In October, we have another Mercury retrograde because, they're every 3 months. And that's October 30th through November 20th. And these are all, I keep the Mercury retrograde cycles on the front page of my website. And then Pluto turns direct. That's another shift, especially because of Saturn and Pluto. They're going to just keep moving closer. So I see another kind of darker time in September and October. Then in November, well, I think possibly between September and December, because then we start to get into the Capricorn stellium, where there's 5 planets in Capricorn, which is that's a lot of planets in Capricorn, which is very contracting. So I'll just very quickly talk about the US. I know that I heard that there have been a couple of people speaking here on the astrology when Pluto went into the US second house, that there would be some financial crashes in the United States. The second house is the house of money and wealth, among other things. So when Pluto goes into your second house, there can be some reconsolidation, some changes in the way that your personal assets are handled, how you feel about them. So Pluto went into the US second house in 2012. There wasn't a crash. We really have not had one since 2008. It's just gone up and up and up. But that's a little bit Plutonic too, because Pluto is intense. It's kind of an obsession. And as long as people are buying stocks and supporting companies, the markets keep going up. So a lot of that has to do with confidence and, they call it consumer confidence. That's really what drives everything. So that's why we can see some of these cycles astrologically, because we can see, Saturn-Pluto, people may not be so confident. They'll start to withdraw. So the US is in a very Plutonic time, beginning back in 2009. So Pluto in the sky has been setting off planets in the US chart. Countries have charts. This church has a chart. Whenever it was born, that's its chart. So I think we can see this Pluto. It's kind of interesting because this was after Obama was inaugurated, and a lot of resistance to having an African American president started to come out. And we started to see kind of the darker side of human nature in this country, which I attribute to Pluto, because that's the lens that I look through. So that continued 2009 through 2011. Then Pluto went into the second house in 2012. And then between 2014 and 2016, Pluto was opposite, which is a challenging aspect, to the sun of the US chart, which is its identity, its essence. And I think we can all agree, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, that those couple of years were very intense and continue to be intense. So the US is having a Pluto return, where Pluto in the sky, you've heard of the Saturn return probably, when Saturn in the sky comes back to its place in your birth chart. And, we have lunar returns and Venus returns, like all the planets return to our birth chart. Very few of us will have a Pluto return because Pluto takes 144, is that right? How many? 250? Yeah, 248 or something. I got that. Anyway, 248 years, I think. So, and very few countries have actually lasted through their Pluto returns. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. The Pluto return begins in February 2022, but it will start to take effect in 2021, which used to seem like a long way away, but it's 2 years. So there's been some discussion about constitutional crisis, and so it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen. But I think it's fair to say that there's going to continue to be a lack of stability as things recalibrate, reintegrate, restabilize. I don't feel like, the country is going to fall apart necessarily. But I think we definitely there's definitely some change. It doesn't have to affect us all personally. I know a lot of my friends and some family members just take all of this so personally and feel that their own lives are being compromised. And I personally feel, I think probably everybody in this room might agree because that's why you're here, but we can change the vibration, and that really it's our duty to change this vibration. And I'm really excited about all these Neptune cycles that we have going on next year, because that is going to help us to do that. So I think that's a good place to start. I could really stay here for a couple hours, but I think there are some microphones, and I would be very happy to answer questions. This lady here, who I think I know.
I just wanted to ask about the north and south nodes that were changing signs.
Oh, and you know what? I didn't actually have that in my notes because it's a little esoteric. And to be honest with you, I can't remember when that is. So see me afterwards. I have my computer. We'll talk. Does anybody else have a question that hopefully I can answer?
One issue that is coming up for me in this country is having grown up in the country where everything was about values, honesty, integrity, being true to other people, keeping your word. My big issue right now is what in the hell is happening in America, because it seems like the people that are supposed to be leading this country, and this applies to many politicians, they just stand up there and lie constantly, and yet that seems to be acceptable.
Well,
what is that all about?
I have two words to explain that. Pluto.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I mean, that's what we're seeing, is we're seeing the darkness coming out. Pluto is the god of the underworld. When you lift up the rocks and you see all the violence, the gun violence, the murders. I mean, the number of people being killed. This is plutonic. This is dark underworld stuff. And it has to come out in order to be healed. Think just like in our personal life, when we have a personal crisis, we can't just cover it up. It's going to come out. So that's my astrological interpretation.
Thank you.
Who else?
I don't know, can you hear me?
Ah.
Okay. What if you have 4 or more planets in one house? What does that actually mean to an individual? And I guess I'm sure it would mean which planets those are in a house.
Well, yes, and what the rest of the chart is doing. But essentially, that's a very focused energy. And are the 4 planets in the house all in the same sign? Or are they in different signs?
Uranus, Pluto, or 2 of them?
Okay. So it depends. If they're all in the same sign, it's going to have a little different flavor than if they're in different signs. You can have different signs in different houses. But when you have a concentration of planets in a house, we call that a stellium, and there's a focus. So in this lifetime, that's an important house for you that really is going to demand a lot of your attention. I think this lady here.
Oh, okay. How long in the United States are we going to be dealing with this Pluto-like expose of the dark side? And
Do you really want to know?
yeah, I mean, are we in for a decade of having to clean it up, of seeing it, of dealing with it?
Well, it's hard to really, everybody has free will. My belief is that we all have free will.
Yeah.
Humans have free will. So how long are people going to put up with some of the darkness? You know,
Right.
how many children have to be killed in parking lots before we do something about guns, for example? That's as political as I'm going to get, or I'll be thrown out. But so that kind of a thing, you know, the planets aren't making this happen.
No.
The darkness is there, and Pluto, the god Pluto, has said, United States, I'm going to expose all of this, just as you said, the Plutonian expose, perfect. The astrology says probably through 2024,
Okay.
which may be 2025. That's the end of the U.S. Pluto return. So, you know, as far as what happens between now and then, that's how many years? 6 years?
Yeah.
It all depends on the people. So that's not something, that's an example of where we can't really predict the future.
No, but if the country needs to deal with its shadow, then it needs to deal with its shadow. Nothing is going to cover that over. Now that the genie's out of the bottle, I don't perceive that it's going to go back in.
It's not going to go back in, but it can be transformed. It can be transmuted into something different. I think that's what we'll see.
And last question, is there a planetary energy equal to Pluto that would suggest transformation?
Well, Pluto is the planet of transformation. So Pluto, there is, in the way, in my work, there's no negative, and nothing is bad and nothing is good. People are like, well, isn't Jupiter good? But Jupiter can be not good. Jupiter can make us complacent and lazy and think, oh yeah, everything is great, I'll just sit around, can I have more chocolate, please? You know, so, and Pluto, under Pluto, we work. You know, we may have a crisis in our life, we may have something devastating happen, but we usually come out of it we don't always, you know, sometimes people do die under Pluto cycles, but it's more common that they don't. And usually they emerge from that and they go, wow, that was horrible, but I am such a different person now. You know, that was such a valuable experience. None of us would choose it. So Pluto is that planet of transformation. Pluto is that god that can make this, that can transmute this energy if the humans will allow that to happen. Like, this is when that can happen. And there is a lot of karma, I feel. Look at some of the things that have happened to the Native Americans, and just, you know, what's happening in South America is because of our policies. There's everything, every action has an opposite reaction. Oh no, one more question. This lady up here?
Actually, these folks.
Could I have two? Okay.
Yeah, these folks were first.
Two. Okay, I got this one here. All right, great. In your opinion and in your expertise in your area and in the way that I feel, if you clean house, if you take care of those issues in your chart that give you opportunities to grow, is it necessarily true then that a negative aspect or a square or anything in opposition actually has to affect you in a negative way? We just talked about it brings to the surface that stuff that's in there that may be negative, giving you an opportunity to take care of it. But if you clear that, does every planet, like Mercury and Saturn, when it retrogrades in my house, I have wonderful things happening, okay? And so I can't complain about that, but I also spend 35 years working on cleaning house. So is it true then that they don't have to affect you in that negative way just because it has that type of behavior?
So we call that alchemizing the transits. And I think, so on one level, I would say, just like you've experienced, like what you've done, I would say absolutely yes. And I've experienced that, you know, myself. I've been on this journey of healing, and certain transits that have had effects on me in the past don't now. And you start to learn to work with the inner, oh, this is Saturn, I know what I need to do. This is Pluto. You know, I know I've just been going through a Pluto transit myself for like 8 months. Pluto has hardly moved. And I feel like I'm a piece of coal that is being like crunched into a diamond. You know how that process, it's just relentlessly, but yeah, so I think on one level, yes. Things do happen though. You know, a parent can die. You can lose, you know, pets can, like people around you can die. And so things can certainly happen. You can lose a job that maybe you thought you wanted. Later you would find out that it wasn't the right one. But essentially, I would agree with you, you know, completely. I think when we're younger, planetary cycles affect us more because we're sort of reacting against their energies. Even if we don't know the astrology, we still are, you know, more reacting. We're more acting out of reaction than in sort of a more thoughtful approach. So then this lady, maybe, and then...
I was just going to say, like, we have, okay, the Pluto here... Oh, I'm sorry. The Pluto here is at 27 degrees of Capricorn. But this was the planet of the United States. But this is not the planet of the revolution of the United States. The revolution happened before Pluto got to 27 degrees. So it, as you see here, we've got Sun, Jupiter, Venus, conjunct, all in Cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So could that mean some kind of a, you know, beginning of a revolution that started maybe, you know, a few years back when Pluto began its journey, somewhere, you know, beginning in Capricorn. And as we talked, 2008 had the economic downturn, real downturn, that's still downturning. And could that mean some kind of a revolution in this country?
I'm not
it happened
seeing
before.
that in the...
This is a return. This is a Pluto return. Could that mean that?
I'm not really seeing that in the astrology. You know, that would have, astrologically speaking, that energy was when Uranus went through all those planets, which it just did a few years ago. I understand your point, and if we looked at the chart of the revolution, I suppose that would give us different information. This is the chart of the signing of the Constitution. So this is when the actual nation was born. Do you see what I'm saying? So under this heavy Pluto influence, there's less revolution and there's more oppression typically. So I'm not really seeing that in the astrology, but I hope you're right. So thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. Take care and have a great year.
Thank you, Lynn. And just a reminder, if you do want to get her discounted personal astrological session with her, you can sign up here tonight. Thank you. Or for her blogs. We really appreciate y'all coming. See you next time.